Welcome back to our budget special, and welcome to New Zealand Herald economics editor Brian Fallow and Jo Doolan, a tax partner at Ernst and Young. Welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us this morning. You've just heard, Jo, what our CEOs had to say. They said it was challenging but positive, that essentially the country's on the right track. What's your verdict on this budget?
My verdict was probably it was about a 7 out of 10 in that I really felt we were tinkering at the edges a little bit and sleepwalking our way towards a surplus.
Tinkering is a word that we hear reasonably often in the last couple of days about this. Has the government really got to grips, do you think, with the challenges that the economy is facing?
In some ways, the stability of heading towards that surplus is critical. However, if we want to generate growth, my feeling was we need to be doing a lot more in rebalancing and incentivising the economy to grow, actually, rather than just meander through to a surplus.
Those CEOs, though, didn't seem to have a problem, Brian.
Well, they do in a sense, which is about the distortions around an increasingly superheated housing market and whether the budget has really done enough about that. And my judgment there, I think, would be no, it hasn't. I mean, the supply side stuff that they've arranged with the Auckland Council is all well and good, but there is, as the IMF itself reminded us this week, still a major tax distortion. And the IMF linked the fact that we have these very high house prices relative to incomes and very low household savings rates to the fact that the only real tax-preferred saving option in New Zealand is housing. So until they start addressing that dimension of the problem, I don't think we're going to get very far.
How could they address it?
Well, there's two. I mean, the normal answer you hear is a capital gains tax, but another advantage that landlords have is the ability to borrow a very large proportion of the cost of buying a rental property and then deduct the interest cost of that. They're treated as having gone into business and they can deduct all the costs that they incur earning a taxable income. Yeah. But most businesses can't borrow to that extent. And if, say, a foreign investor tried to debt finance their New Zealand operations to that extent, they'd come up against thin capitalisation rules. So if you were to limit the extent to which property investors can deduct interest, they might pay a lower price, and therefore the owner-occupier who has to outbid them in an auction might get away with a slightly lower price.
Would that work, Jo?
It could work, and I think the thin cap of requiring businesses to have a certain amount of equity versus debt borrowings could apply across the board to provide more stability for business, not just in the housing market. Because don't forget that also with shares, you can borrow to buy shares and get an interest deduction for those. I agree with Brian that just looking at capital gains tax as being the magic solution is not going to work. It needs to be wider than that, and certainly the thin cap idea is a very good one.
Brian, I know through the Official Information Act you've got a little bit of information recently about a difference really between the government and the Reserve Bank on this.
Yes, I mean,
on the loan-to-value ratio.
It didn't require the OIA. The Reserve Bank just published yesterday two documents, including its final policy position. This is on the macro-prudential tools that the Minister thinks. The most potent of which would be to restrict lending at high loan-to-value ratios or low deposits. Now, the Prime Minister yesterday in a speech here in Auckland indicated that maybe the bank would exempt first home buyers from that. But if it did that, of course, it would massively reduce the effectiveness of this instrument. And certainly the documents that the bank produced yesterday, while they didn't rule that out, made it clear that they were thinking quite a different way about how to use that new tool that they've just been given. So I wondered a little bit, unless the Prime Minister knows something that we don't, which is always possible, of course, that was perhaps a little bit disingenuous or mischievous on his part to raise false hopes there.
Yeah, Jo, what do you make of that?
I think, you know, if we just go back to the overall thing of trying to squash the housing sector price increases, there's, you know, and we go back to the capital gains tax solution that often gets raised, there is, I think, a need for cross-party support as to how we work towards a solution, so that we're not going into the next election, say, and having a change of government or the election after that. And that uncertainty in itself creates incentives, I think, for people to sit there and do nothing. When you look at the balance of what's needed to grow the economy, it's a platform of certainty.
Are we tiptoeing around the issue here, Brian? Has the Auckland housing market really become, you know, the major issue here for our economy?
It's a risk to the outlook, and I get the impression that the Treasury and the government have been perhaps a little bit behind the curve in catching up with just how fast prices are growing from a starting point that is already extremely high. The IMF estimated that our houses are already 20% overvalued. And so it is a bit scary given, as again the Minister pointed to examples in the Northern Hemisphere of what happens to an economy when a property bubble bursts all over it. That's a real risk, or a rapidly emerging risk, to an otherwise reasonably benign economic outlook of the kind that the chief executives can see. So it's sitting there as a threat, and I'm not sure that they're using all the tools that they could or need to address that threat.
Andrew Thorburn, the CEO of BNZ, just said to us that, you know, we need to, or the government needs to provide other investment opportunities and we need to look beyond sort of property and things. What would be the impact then of, you know, Meridian Energy, the sale of that and their asset sales?
I thought, I frankly disapproved of the decision to put Meridian up for sale next. And that's because of all the power companies, that's the one whose value would be knocked about most by what Labor and the Greens propose to do. Also, and that policy also massively undermines Meridian's negotiating position with the owners of the smelter. At the moment, that's still up in the air. And now they're under pressure, Meridian that is, to get some deal, any deal, with the smelter so that the float can proceed. So there's almost this toxic interaction between the policies on both sides of the house, the net effect of which will be bad for both electricity consumers and taxpayers.
Jo, how important are these asset sales?
From the point of view of putting more into the stock exchange and growing it, very important. What I'm not certain about is whether, you know, the dividends foregone by selling down a portion of that and then reinvesting in infrastructure type assets, it will give us that payback in comparison to the foregone income.
Okay. Do you agree, I want to touch on the current account deficit here, do you agree that the government might have overlooked this a little bit, or could the government be doing more to address this issue?
Well, there's two ways. I mean, it's our Achilles heel. It has been, you know, for 40 years, or it's more of an Achilles leg. It's a huge weakness that the economy has. The problem with the approach that you get from the left here is that it's all about boosting exports by trying to manipulate the exchange rate and things like that. But the current account is also a measure of the gap between our national savings and the investment going on in the economy. And if you, for example, run budget deficits, that's bad government savings, and that will make the current account deficit worse, not better. So, I mean, the government's entitled to say that by getting on top of the deficit, it is helping to reduce the current account deficit and the amount that we need to finance.
Jo, just quickly, what do you think would encourage household savings, compulsion or tax?
Tax incentives in Australia have worked well, but then you end up with this massive fund that has to be invested somewhere, and that in itself can create distortions. So I think we need to again look at cross-party support for something that is going to work in our 20-year plan, rather than leaping from election to election with you know, policies that can be politically appealing but are economically unsound.
Brian Fallow, election year next year. This has been a budget that's tinkered really. So what are we going to expect here? Something a little bit more ambitious from the government?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, these are pretty conservative economic forecasts underpinning it. So I think they might be sort of banking a rosier economic outlook flowing through to their revenues to give themselves a bit more. They did loosen the purse strings a bit this year, but you know, the electoral logic may start to loom large by this time next year.
Indeed. Okay. And Jo, what are you expecting from an election year budget?
I think there will, as Brian said, the purse strings will be loosened a little more. Again, my concern would be that that is detrimental to the long-term objectives that we're trying to achieve.
All right. Jo Doolan, Ernst and Young tax partner, and Brian Fallow, New Zealand Herald economics editor. Thank you.